What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking into Sportsnaut. Carolyn, Manno with you, joined as always by Chris Mannix, senior writer at Sports Illustrated. Chris, let's start with LaMelo Ball, rookie sensation, obviously doing big things in Charlotte. Can he make Charlotte a free agent destination?
Well, I think he has the best chance to do it of anybody, maybe in the history of the Hornets franchise. I mean, no team needed an infusion of energy, of name recognition, of star power more than Charlotte did. I mean, the Hornets have had some good players over the years. Kemba Walker had a really strong 7-year run in Charlotte, but they haven't had any player that really brings the charisma and brings the magnetism of a LaMelo Ball. I mean, for the most part, the biggest star has been in the owner's box in Michael Jordan. And you bring LaMelo Ball into that mix, not only has he made them competitive now, but in the future, if this team continues to build around him, they're going to become a place that players will want to go. Up until this point, the Charlotte Hornets have been the team that's had to overpay, whether it's for a Nicholas Batum or more recently a Gordon Hayward. They haven't had guys that want to play there. They're still not going to be that premier destination, but LaMelo Ball, in a lot of the same ways I think that Jason Kidd did during his time in New Jersey, I think is going to become a magnet for players to want to play with.
In Brooklyn, they have no shortage of star power, obviously. I mean, that's a destination that's attractive for a lot of reasons, especially with all the pieces they have. And now Blake Griffin is going to be back on the floor this week. He's been riddled with injury over the course of his career. But what impact do you see him having with the Nets?
Well, I think everybody has to remember that this is not going to be the Blake Griffin that was so great in LA, that had a couple of good seasons in Detroit. He is just a different player now because of those injuries. Look, he hasn't dunked since 2019. This was the guy that dunked over the Kia. Like, he hasn't dunked since 2019, and we don't know exactly what kind of spring he has in his legs. All that being said, the Nets have been the team that has literally signed players off the street. I mean, whether it's Andre Roberson or Iman Shumpert, they have been desperate for months for a talent infusion in the aftermath of having to gut their roster to acquire James Harden. Blake Griffin can play a role with that team. I think he is most likely going to be used as a small ball center, somebody that kind of platoons with the DeAndre Jordan rather than plays alongside him. The NBA has been going smaller in recent years. There's no reason that Blake can't be a 5 with this team. And he has shown an improved three-point shot over the last few years as he's tried to modernize his game to today's NBA. So, he's not going to be a guy that can give you 20 points per game on many nights, but I think he can still be a very serviceable rotation player and someone that, frankly, is better than what the Nets are rolling out there anyway.
The Nets seemingly have picked up where they left off after the All-Star break. They're on a tear. When you look at what they've been able to do without Kevin Durant, should they be in any rush to get him back on the floor?
Not right now, because the hamstring injury that Kevin Durant suffered was significant, and you do want to make sure that you don't rush him back. I mean, Kevin Durant, it was just in 2019 where maybe he was rushed back a little bit in the NBA Finals and wound up suffering a more severe injury. The last thing you want to have happen is for Kevin Durant to push it too hard and come back into the mix. And to your point, James Harden and Kyrie Irving have developed a terrific chemistry, and having those two alphas on the floor, the Nets have more than enough offense. But you do want to make sure that you get 20, 30 games under your belt with Durant playing alongside Harden and Kyrie Irving. You want those three guys to develop chemistry so that when you get into the playoffs, you have some idea of how well they're going to play together. The Nets, to me, are the most talented team right now in the Eastern Conference, but they don't have the chemistry of some of the teams they might face in the second and third round of the playoffs. So it's not a rush, but as we creep deeper into March and into early April, there will be urgency to get Durant back on the floor.
You hear about these nightmare chemistry scenarios where all of a sudden you have lose a player to injury and the lineup that's out on the floor starts playing really well. And then all of a sudden it's like you've got the problems that you didn't think you would have. I mean, is that the line of demarcation in your mind? April is when you need to make sure that whatever they're going to do heading into the playoffs, which feel like they're coming really fast, they start to implement that around that time frame so that they're not in a situation where they don't really know what they're doing chemistry wise when it starts to really count?
Yeah, I think if you talk to people in Brooklyn, they want to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And look, basketball is not a video game. Like, you can't just throw talent together and expect them to be successful. We have seen countless examples of teams that are built that way that haven't succeeded. Remember the Lakers from 10 years ago when they added Dwight Howard to Kobe and Steve Nash? That didn't work. I mean, James Harden's had multiple teammates in Houston that brought star power. That didn't work. You've got to find a way to make sure you can play together. And look, that involves sacrifice from one or more players on any given night. Now, one reason the Nets are optimistic about their chances of developing that chemistry is that James Harden, when he's had to, has embraced the role of playmaker. He hasn't come into Brooklyn and said, I need to be the 30, 35 point per game scorer that I've been for the last 4 or 5 years. He said, look, I will, be a facilitator, be a point guard, and let Kyrie Irving's offense take off. So I think if he continues to have that attitude, it's going to make it a lot easier for these Nets to coalesce.
Kyrie Irving's issues have been well documented from past teammates, those that he's come into contact with, that maybe he's not the easiest, or maybe he's a little bit more nuanced. Did this surprise you, though, that James Harden has been able to be a little bit more selfless? Have they found something in each other? I don't want to be too ridiculous, but like a kinship, so to speak, that has allowed them both to embrace more what's going to be necessary for this to ultimately work?
Yeah, I think you give both guys a lot of credit for how they've handled this situation early. Harden for the reasons I articulated, and Kyrie because Kyrie didn't sign on to Brooklyn to play with James Harden. And that matters here because one of the things that's frustrated Kyrie Irving over most of his career is that he has often been put in positions that he hasn't chosen. He didn't choose to play with LeBron James. LeBron decided to come back to Cleveland. Now, it wound up being a successful partnership, but as you saw after year 3, Kyrie was done with it. He wanted to trade out of Cleveland. He was then traded to Boston, a place he didn't choose to go to, and wound up having some issues there. Brooklyn was the place he chose to play, and Kevin Durant was the teammate that he chose to play with. All of a sudden, a year plus in, here's a new teammate. But Kyrie Irving, I think, has handled that spectacularly. I'm not surprised that Harden's handled it so well for 2 reasons. One, Harden is on the other side of 30 now, and he's looking at this being the last window to potentially win multiple championships. And the other thing people forget is, even though it feels like a lifetime ago, when Harden was in Oklahoma City, he was very deferential. Scott Brooks has told me many times that Harden was not only a sixth man in Oklahoma City because the coaching staff wanted it, Harden wanted it. He wanted to be a sixth man in that situation, was willing to take a back seat to Russell Westbrook and to Kevin Durant. Now, a lot's changed since then, but I think that attitude still exists within James Harden that, winning matters more than just individual statistics. He's got his MVP. He's got his numbers. Now he wants to win. And by being more of a playmaker, that's given the Nets the best chance.
Yeah, that's great insight. Trade deadline, Chris, is coming up. It's not too far away. Which teams do you have your eye on?
Well, I think everybody around the NBA is waiting to see what Boston does. The Celtics have a $28.5 million trade exception. That is the largest trade exception in NBA history. They can go out and effectively bring in a guy with a $20 million plus salary and not have to give much, if anything, back in return. That's an incredibly valuable asset for teams that are out there that may want to get off a big contract. Boston's got its eyes on Harrison Barnes, the small forward out of Sacramento. He's the kind of 3-and-D type player they're looking for. He's got championship experience from his years with Golden State. They're also looking at Jeremy Grant, who's had a terrific season in Detroit. He has really been a breakthrough player for the Pistons this year. I don't know if Detroit wants to move him, but that's someone the Celtics have their eye on. And it's also San Antonio. The Spurs have made it known that LaMarcus Aldridge will not finish the season with them. Right now, they're actively trying to find a trade partner for Aldridge, the ex-All-Star, who has started to slow down a little bit in his mid-30s, but is still a pretty prolific scorer who has developed into a really good three-point shooter over the last couple of years. Teams will be calling around. If it's not Aldridge via trade, there will be, I think, a feeding frenzy for him if he hits free agency after the March 25th deadline. If
Danny Ainge can land an impact player at the trade deadline, does he come out of this looking a little bit better than fans originally thought?
Well, I think fans are naturally impatient, and I think there should be some impatience when it comes to using this trade exception. I mean, Danny's argument for keeping it would probably be that you can use it this summer. And when you're talking about free agency and making money work, that's a pretty valuable piece in the offseason as well. But watching the Celtics team, they need something. They need to add a piece if they're going to hope to compete with Brooklyn and Miami and Milwaukee and some in Philadelphia and the top tier teams in the Eastern Conference. And that trade exception is the best chance to do it. So I don't think they're going to, go out and get a guy that doesn't fit what they try to do. But there are players, whether it's Barnes or Grant or their old friend Al Horford, who's having a good season in Oklahoma City. There are guys they can get. And I think that that would go a long way to alleviating the concern that Celtics fans have.
Just something else for you, speaking with NFL analysts here on Sportsnaut over the last couple of weeks, one of the things that has become clear is that we are in something of a player empowerment era, and that's true in the NBA as well. We're seeing big stars have more leverage than ever before. And what the NFL analysts have touched on is that they feel like some of the players in the NBA, top tier quarterbacks, that sort of thing, in the NFL has kind of adopted this model of the NBA where big stars go where they want to go, with the exception, of course, that the franchise tag exists in the NFL and that if you're a really good NFL player, you're going to stay there. Do you think that the NBA would ever consider something of a franchise tag in order to avoid having that leverage pendulum swing as wildly as it does in the league?
Yeah, the NBA, the league office, they would love to have a franchise tag. The problem is they can't unilaterally implement one. It has to be collectively bargained, and the players union has made it perfectly clear they have no interest in making that part of the NBA offseason. The NBA is just it's a lot different than the NFL in the sense that NBA players are far more willing than in any other sport to bet on themselves. And what I mean by that is they are willing to leave guaranteed money on the table. The NFL doesn't have long-term guaranteed contracts. The NBA does. And that theoretically should allow teams to tie players to long-term deals. But the top players, to maintain their flexibility in terms of where they can go, have been willing to roll the dice and leave guaranteed money on the table. They'll sign 2-year deals instead of 5-year deals or 4-year deals because they want to have the flexibility to leave the situation that they're in exchange for, getting that money more on the back end and rolling the dice and saying, I'm not going to get injured and my career will continue. Because frankly, there's no evidence that teams are afraid of big injuries. Look, Kevin Durant suffered an Achilles tear. An Achilles tear is the worst injury an NBA player could possibly suffer. Kevin Durant was in, at the time, his late 20s, now his early 30s. The Brooklyn Nets signed him to a 4-year max contract. So if you're a player and you're a star player, even if you get injured, there really isn't a huge risk of losing out on those big paydays. I just don't think it's going to happen with the NFL. I think the NFL players are always going to get as much money as they can when they can. There might be some movement here or there, but NBA players, because they're willing to bet on themselves and leave money on the table, they'll always be more of a player-empowered league.
I know you follow the NBA trends globally, and along these lines, I'm just curious as well if you've noticed a shift in the way that fans are participating in the NBA. And by that, I mean, do you think nowadays, especially with the younger generations of NBA fans who are consuming this product differently, are associating star players with their brands differently, are today's NBA fans rooting more for individual players than for teams themselves, like we've seen in, some of the most significant moments in franchise history over the last couple of decades from those power teams across the board, where it's all about the team or bust? Are we starting to see something different today?
I don't think so. I think fans will always root for the laundry. And I mean, they'll support their team regardless of the name on the back of the jersey. That's just always going to be the case. I mean, they'll support players who may leave in the same way the Celtics supported Paul Pierce when he left Boston, in the same way the Timberwolves supported Kevin Garnett when he left Minnesota. But by and large, you support the team and not the player. And this has been an issue that some players have kind of grumbled about in recent months. There was a situation, and is an ongoing situation, in Cleveland where the Cavaliers decided that Jarrett Allen, the 22-year-old big man they acquired as part of that James Harden trade, he is going to be their center of the future. As such, they have no use for Andre Drummond, who is a pricey player who will be a free agent at the end of the year. They have decided to basically send Andre Drummond home. That hasn't sat well with a lot of players, including Draymond Green, who spoke out about it recently, because a team can just say, we have no use for you, we're going to send you home, and a player can't do that. And fans, generally speaking, do not criticize the team for a decision like that. They basically say, well, yeah, you're thinking about the long-term future. Jarrett Allen is part of your long-term future. Andre Drummond is not. If a player did that, a player is selfish, he's spoiled, he's making all this money, he gets pilloried in the public eye. So I think that some players will always have universal support, but fans, they're always going to root for Jersey.
Chris Mannix of Sports Illustrated, thanks for being with us, as always, on Sportsnaut.
You got it.